Hello, and welcome to the Data Mesh Book Club brought to you by Amazon and Starburst. If you were with us last year, hopefully you enjoyed the discussion that I had with Andy Mott on Jamock's Data Mesh book. Today we start a different book, book 2 in this series. We're going to focus on the Data Mesh in Practice book that was written by Max Schultz and Dr. Arif Wider. If you were with us last year, I hope that you enjoyed not just our discussion, but the engagement that we had via LinkedIn during the show and after the show. If you want to join in today's discussion, you can use the QR code here, or you can search us on LinkedIn, Data Mesh Book Club, join the group, and then you can actually jump into the conversation. A lot of the discussion, to be fair, happens after the show. And so we're really excited, Andy and myself, to kind of join in and learn from each other. This isn't about Andy and I preaching or teaching. This is about kind of driving that community and continuing the conversations. So I'll pause for a second. Hopefully you can capture that QR code and then we'll jump right into it. So Andy, Mott, and I are going to discuss the book. We're going to spend the first 30 minutes of this really just focused on the summary, our favorite points, some challenges, some questions. And then we have a special guest for the second part of the show today. For the last 30 minutes, we're going to have Dr. Arif Wider join us and join the conversation. So we're looking forward to that. All right, let's get started. As we get into this book, what did you think? I mean, I think first and foremost, we have to acknowledge this book was written a year ago. If I'm not mistaken, this is one of the first books that came out after Jamock's book. Is that right?
I have a feeling it actually came out before Jamak's book. It came out some time ago. So I'm just looking now actually. So
What?
yeah, December 2021, right? So that's
Yeah.
well before Jamak's book. It's about 4 or 5 months.
Yeah. And so that being said, I think there's a lot of credit that we can kind of give to the authors, because if we were writing this book in that time frame, there's a lot we didn't know then, right? Somebody would say the book was written. I don't think we'll see what Arif challenges us with a lot of imagination versus experimentation or examination, because there weren't very many use cases out there for the authors to really study and kind of come back with. That being said, we're looking at a very experienced set of data practitioners, right? With Max and Arif, I mean, they know what they're doing. They've done this before, maybe not a full data mesh, but they've done a lot of the concepts. They've proven out a lot of the transformation exercises in other programs, I suspect. I think what they've done is they brought all that knowledge together, and it shows in the book, because even a year later, as you read through it, and as I reread it, there was a lot that I said, wow, they really got that right. I'm going to challenge us though, and so we'll have to kind of get through the summary. When Arif comes on, I'd love to ask the question, what would you add? And maybe we can, you and I,
Yes.
Andy, can challenge him a little bit on some things that maybe we thought, dare I say, they got wrong. And there isn't much I think they got wrong. So let's jump right into it. We're going to start the summary, Andy, I think, with part 2, right? So we're going to skip the data mesh basics. I think we've done that
Yeah.
already as a group.
Yep.
Let's jump
Yeah.
right into the journey. And I think that starts with chapter 3, if I'm not mistaken.
That is correct. This is where the focus is really sort of thinking more about data as a product and that kind of mindset shift towards, so people talk about data as a product, and a lot of times they're talking about kind of technology. And I think certainly the beginnings of this sort of this chapter is thinking about the kind of the culture, if you like, the mindset shift of the organization towards thinking about data as a product. And so I think some of the things that in that first chapter are kind of really relevant today, right? The pain point, the situation where you have to go and find data. It's not necessarily the data you want, or it is the data you want, but it's not been updated, or maybe it was updated for a period, but then it stopped, and now there's some missing data, and you're trying to find who is responsible for this, and that's not clear, and there's the kind of the back and forth, the thing we're kind of used to, and I think this book lays out a couple of just fairly familiar examples of that to highlight why that mindset shift is kind of important.
Yeah, let me pick out a couple of points. On page 20, they're talking about, and I really like this because just yesterday I did another show with Boston Consulting Group. We were talking about a survey that they had released. And it was really interesting. A couple of numbers just kind of tossed some ideas out there, is that we're growing data storage by 40% every year. And that's
Mhm.
great news, especially if you're Amazon, right? So we're storing more data in the cloud and at the edge. What's interesting though, is we're only using 50% of that data. Only 50%, 50% of the data that we're storing, we're actually using.
Yeah.
The other number was scarier, which was there's 90%, 90% of the new data we're creating isn't even being stored right now. I say that
Mhm.
because I pulled one of the lines from the book here that said that we used to think about what we can store as opposed to what we should store. And I think that line maybe is undervalued, because I think more and more now, especially with we could possibly store everything. And I do think we're going to start storing more, maybe not the full 90%, but it's really important more now than ever to really start thinking about what we should be storing and how we should be storing
Mhm.
it and where we should be storing it. And so I wanted to capture that point because I think it's a line that kind of you read and you move on, but it's like, whoa, there's some brilliance there. I want to challenge something. We talk about, and he talks about in the book, or they talk about the idea of perspectives and incentives when you're kind of getting started with this mind shift journey. With
Mhm.
perspectives, I think they nailed it, right? It's important to get the perspective of the producer and of the consumer. And then there's a
Yes.
great paragraph there. Love it. Where I want to
Yep.
challenge is, and we'll challenge Arif when he comes on, is when they start talking about the incentives. I don't think those are the right incentives. We'll come back to that. Maybe we won't beat up that point too much right
Interesting.
now, but I
Yeah.
didn't think those were the right incentives. But let's discuss that with them.
Okay. That's an interesting point of view because I thought they were good. I think I think incentivization has become more sophisticated as regards kind of data products and data mesh over probably the last 12, 13 months
Yep.
since the book was written. But I didn't think they were a terrible start. So
No. The other piece I want to come kind of in the same chapter is when we start talking about starting small. And
mhm.
so you and I have talked about this a lot. There's some
Yeah.
things that we have in our material that when I read this, I was thinking, oh wow, that night I started thinking, did I get that idea from them? I don't know. I think we just both came up with the same concept. But starting small is agile first and foremost, right? It's
Mhm.
about an agile approach, about MVPs. I liked one of the comments where they're talking about starting with teams that are progressive in their ways
Mhm.
of working, right? We tell that
Yeah.
to our customers all the time, right? Go pick a domain team, go pick a stakeholder who wants to work in a domain or in a data mesh approach, right? Pick someone who's already thinking that way. That's the way to win early. And I like that they've called that out because I think that's a great way to get started.
Yep. Yeah. No, I'd agree. Yeah, I'd agree, and also something that you can kind of put a line around is also kind of important, right? So, um, trying to find or trying to create a domain or use a domain, sorry, to start with, which is pulling data from every other part of the business and then giving it to every other part of the business. That's probably not a great place to start either, right? Because you want to start small. You want to start with what's a people who are progressive in their thinking, as you say, and also produce something that's not necessarily kind of mission critical on day one. So yeah, I think this is really, really important.
He calls it out at the end of the book when they kind of go over some of the summary points, more specifically, where they say, do not approach this with an enterprise program, right?
Mhm.
Approach this, and I'm rewording, they probably said it differently in the book, but that's the way I read it. You have to approach it with an MVP, think small. And I love
Yep.
well, I will quote them. They say you need to approach your data mesh program with product thinking, right? Product
Yep.
thinking, start small, focus on features, create a backlog, and build and prioritize the data mesh capabilities that you need today that are going to create value today. Let me
Yep.
fast forward.
Yep.
There's another piece here that I want to challenge Arif when he comes on is, and I think when I first read it, I said, I'm not sure I agree. And then as I got through the book, I was like, oh, okay, I think I know what they meant. They're talking, I think it's page 28. They're talking about when you invest in the platform for data and for the infrastructure.
Mhm.
And I think what the way they present it is you should go out there and build a couple data products first. Think about how
Mhm.
you're building them, who you're building them for, how they're going to be used before you
Yep.
go invest. And I sat back and I said, I'm not sure. I mean, how is that right? Is that the way you do it? When I went back and again in the latter chapter, I think he comes back and says, and I think they give more context. Like, and what they mean is you have to work slowly, right? Don't go build this huge platform when you only need the
Yep.
pieces, kind of tying back to what I just said.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. So, lots of people say, well, we need a catalog. We need to do, we need maybe graph, and maybe we need REST endpoints, and maybe we need this and that and whatever. But I kind of think, let's just get some data that people can run queries against first. Let's just have that as a win. And then when we get to the point where we've got a requirement for a number of data products that we then need to think about, well, how do we find them and organize them? Then maybe we bring in a catalog, and and then we get to the point where we say, actually, some of these need to be part of some of the data products are going to be consumed in different ways. Well, then maybe we look at the APIs or whatever it might be. So, and this to me is exactly what you said. It's that product thinking applied not only to the data but also to the platform.
Yep.
Bringing in the capabilities that are needed as you go.
And we're getting to chapter 4 now, where they're talking about scaling the mesh, and I started to pick this up at about chapter 4. I think I feel like at the very first page of the book, he talks about data ownership and responsibility. That's one of the things I love about this book, is that that's a key theme throughout the book. They hit on that point over and over and over again, rightfully so. And I think that's an area maybe a lot of us might take for granted, right? There's an example they gave, and I almost felt like I was reading my personal use case. I lived it there. I think it's page 29. They're talking about pain points. They're talking about where a central team takes on full responsibility. In 2019, I built this thing I used to call a data service, and with my central team, and we used to, it was on SharePoint. We created fact tables in the back end that we offered. We didn't use the word data product, but they were, for all intents and purposes, data products that people could read about, identify, and then request access for. We became the mechanism for access approvals, and we got overrun almost immediately. We got overrun by requests for more data products. We got overrun by requests for access. We were having to be the steward between the owners, and it was. And so when I read that on page 29, I was like, God, I've lived that, right? And so this whole chapter, I think, is about thinking about, one is driving the self-service concept of making sure that people can do more on their own, but two, making sure that everybody understands they're a part of the responsibility game, if you will, right? Everyone has something to play, and if the central team thinks they can do too much, you're going to get overrun.
Yeah, no, I think I wholeheartedly agree. And I think this is somewhat based on Max's kind of experience working in a central team, where I think they kind of wanted control because they'd always had control, and what they realized was they had to relinquish control kind of more and more as they sort of went along their journey towards data mesh. So yeah, we say this as if it's easy.
No, yeah, it's not. And I love the way he says it's, and he doesn't make it sound easy. In fact, that's why he keeps talking about it. They keep talking about it, but they're talking about striking that balance, which is hard to do. And frankly, I think it's different for every organization.
Yep.
So again, we could talk about that for another 20 minutes, but it's a really, really important piece. Chapter 5, we start talking about sustaining the mesh, right? And I thought it was interesting because when the first thing you do when you pick up a book, you go and you look at the table of contents or the agenda, and sustaining the mesh, federated governance. And I was like, wow, that's, to me, I didn't understand how the two were tying together. Sustainability to me would be a much bigger topic. But as I read through it, I was like, okay, I see what they're talking about. The importance of federation, how important it is to make sure that you're federating accordingly if you want to sustain this. Again, back to the same point about being overrun. Try to do everything yourself, you're going to be overrun. If you try to do all the governance centrally, you're going to be overrun. You have to federate the governance. There was a really cool, I think it's on page, gosh, I didn't write the page number. I don't know if it was page 29, but he has a chart where he talks about the federated governance group, the data product.
Page 41.
Yeah. What'd you think of that?
So it's funny. It's funny because even today, when I was in a session last week where I was talking about sort of data mesh in Switzerland, and even today, that kind of 3-level sort of picture, if you will, which pretty much maps to this 3-level picture, is really relevant and really works for explaining how this really should work. In my opinion, my interpretation of Zhamak's work, at least, how this really should work in in the real world. So it's very prescient, right? These guys, Arif Max, put this together more than a year ago.
Yeah.
The relevancy is still there today, right? This idea of getting a bunch of people together to define some rules, getting the data product development team or the domains to kind of comply with those rules, and then having the self-service infrastructure platform kind of enforce or check the compliance with those rules. That's sort of it's almost like bread and butter stuff when I talk. But again, only last week talking to a group of people, and it was a bit of an eye opener for them.
Well, it wasn't bread and butter for me a year ago, right?
No, that's true.
I learned these lessons by examination, by talking to customers, by looking at what they've done, how they've done it, what's worked and hasn't worked. And so, yeah, again, I think it's brilliant that they covered these points so early in the journey for most of us. There's something that they talked about here that I want to cover as well. There's an example that they give, and I think it's a European law. They use it as a use case.
Oh, is this GDPR?
Right. They're talking about, I think so. I think that's what they refer to. But they're using that as an example to underscore the importance of automation and underscore the idea of saying, look, you can't put all of the responsibility on your consumers to go out there and in this case, delete data or archive data based on a specific request. I think there's a specific law that says, forget it or
right to be forgotten.
Right to be forgotten. Yeah.
Yes.
When I read that, and the reason why that didn't resonate with me initially, is because I don't have, and maybe it's our
you're American.
well, yeah. It's like, what are you crazy Europeans doing now? No, because I think I don't have that issue in our solution. But again, in any data mesh, it's going to be an ecosystem, and you're going to have many different ways to build a data product. So I want to contrast something here. If you're leaving data at the source, and you're querying that data to deliver to a solution, but you're not kind of permanently storing that data anywhere in the middle, this isn't a problem. It's not the same problem, right? If you're moving data from source to another location, now you've got to delete it at the source, and you have to follow the data lineage pattern, delete it everywhere else you've copied or moved it to. I get the issue. I get the problem. So I think when you start thinking about building data products, sometimes it's advantageous to not move the data, leave it at the source, control it at the source, and then let, whether you're creating materialized views or whether you're caching views, let those basically expire on their own.
So I'd agree. I'd agree with that. I think there's probably a spectrum, and it's interesting because I think then you get to different. This is a slight tangent, but I'll come back. But you get to different viewpoints of how you deal with data in data products and a data mesh. And you've talked about, in my opinion, kind of one extreme, one end of the spectrum, which is never duplicate data across the kind of data mesh. The other end of the spectrum is duplicate data everywhere. Every data product holds its own copy, et cetera, and actually, I think the pragmatist in me says that you're probably going to be somewhere on that spectrum. I would argue that you should be as far towards zero copy as possible, for lots of reasons, and this is one of them. So I understand exactly what you're saying, that actually this isn't the right to be forgotten, PII, kind of preventing personal data from being made available, and also the right, making sure that data gets removed. The fewer copies of data you've got, the easier that problem is to sort of solve. And then obviously automation is actually the tool that you want to use at the very least to determine that you've got data that needs to be removed. There's an argument about how far you go down that route in terms of, do you really want to automate the removal of all that data, or do you want to have some manual checking somewhere? And the reason I say that is actually in any system, right, you may want to remove things that are customer identified. Just on this particular point, you may want to remove things that are customer identifiable, but you may not want to remove the actual record, right? And the reason I say this is, if I've got transactions that are linked to a customer, I don't want to get rid of that customer because now I've got orphan transactions, right, that don't belong to anyone. So what I probably want to do is I probably want to mask, hide, remove the thing that says that this was Andy, and just give it like a hash or something. And now I can still see that there was a customer who bought these things. But you want to automate that as far as you possibly can. I think with some manual intervention on top of that, and it's probably the central team that are responsible for the central enablement team that is responsible for building that and managing that automation along with the platform team. And then the data product team is probably the people that press the button.
Yeah,
if that makes sense, on actually performing the action.
No, absolutely. And I'm going to save chapter 6 for Arif when he gets. That's a great way for us to start. But I want to just sticking on chapter 5 because a couple of things that are. I mean, chapter 5 could have been its own book, and I'm not sure that it all. I would have titled the whole thing "Federated Computational Governance," but there's something else here that I really thought was important. They're talking about the interoperability between data products and how difficult that is. And I know we've both seen how difficult that is. I've seen in organizations that have built hundreds of data products that are stacked on top of each other, core strong dependencies, and you've created kind of a rat's nest of sorts now because you can't make a change to this one without affecting 16 other things that then affect another 40 things. And that's challenging, right? You build different data products differently. Like when they said early in the book, you think about your consumer, you think about what your needs are, and you design it accordingly. Coming back to our approach, I don't think we have that problem because I always tell it when I talk to companies, and I know you and I maybe don't agree completely on this point, but I don't like stacking data products. I like to build, I think as much as possible, every data product should stand on its own. Doesn't always work that way. I know we have customers that like to, you have one team building these data products and then another team uses those to build, and then you have more of a supply chain. Makes sense. I get it. And when you have that type of governance, perfect. You're going to have better dependency management. But if you don't have that type of governance, I would say everyone builds your own data products. There's a line here that I really liked. It says, one of the ideas of data mesh is that there is not one central source of truth, but multiple contextualized versions of the truth. I love that because what I'm saying is I'm not changing the data. I'm using the same source data, but for my purposes in sales, I need to organize it this way. And somebody else might say, I'm using that same source data, but for my business contextualized reason, I need to organize it differently. And because I'm not moving the data around, I'm just taking the window of the source. Hey, Arif, you just joined us just in time. So anyway, I really love that point. We were about to summarize chapter 6, and so you joined just in time because I want to come.
Somehow I can't hear anything yet, but I think that's on my side.
We will pause.
We'll pause for a second for Arif to get on.
Maybe Adrian can sing a song so that Arif can hear.
Can
you hear us yet?
You shouldn't have said that. You're gonna regret. I can do one of my.
Yes. No, I can hear.
Awesome.
I was about to sing, Arif. You save the audience. Save the audience. Hey, welcome to the show, Arif.
Hey, good to meet you.
I think you and Andy are old buddies. Is that right?
We've met once or twice.
Exactly.
Yeah, we've met once or twice.
Awesome. Don't know if that qualifies as buddies, but let's say the one or two times that we met were nice.
Yeah.
Well, fantastic. Welcome to our show. We've got about 30 minutes left to have a discussion. Your timing is perfect. Thank you, first of all, for joining us. I'll quickly give you a 2-minute or less summary of what we've discussed so far. And what we'd like to do in the second part of the show here is just kind of get your thoughts on a couple of things. And I'll tell you now so you can start thinking about it. One of the things that we like to do is there's a couple of things that I'm not going to say that we want to challenge, but simply there's a couple of things that we want to say, what do we really mean here? What do we really mean there? And then I'd love, and this is the hard question, I'd love to kind of get your thought, because one of the things that I said at the beginning was you guys wrote this book a year ago. More than a year ago. You were early when you all wrote this book, and I think it's brilliant, by the way. I think you got a lot of it right. And I think there are lessons that you portrayed here, if you will, that it took us a lot longer to realize, right? I didn't see a lot of this stuff in practice for months, another 6 months after you wrote it. And so there weren't a lot of use cases for you to go off, but I think you got a lot right. So I'd love to hear what you would add to the book if you could amend it today. So we'll come back to that question at the end. So what we've done so far is we started today with the kind of the part 2, right? We skipped the data mesh foundation piece only because I think we've spent a lot of time talking about that in a previous book club. And we really dug into the journey chapter. We dug into a couple of the key areas there. We picked kind of our favorite lines from the book, Andy and myself. For the most part, I think you'll hear when you hear the recording again, you'll see we're very positive. There's a lot of great stuff in there. We underscored some things that we thought were really, really important for people to kind of pull out. And then there were a couple of things that we said, let's ask Arif about that. And I think that's where we might get into now. But I think the right way to structure that is to just jump into chapter 6, because that's a great way, I think, to drive that conversation.
Let me check.
Great.
We've all got our copies.
Industry practices.
Yeah, yes. Industry practices, and we'll start with common pitfalls. Maybe I'm gonna let Andy go first on what your thoughts are. Anything you'd like to ask Arif on some of those common pitfalls?
I mean, the obvious one, I guess, is misunderstanding the data mesh concept. I think so. Obviously, since you wrote the book, and Adrian said you wrote this book a long time ago, but I still see this. I see, I give presentations, or and I have discussions with people who kind of come up and they say, we're building a data mesh, and you sort of say, oh, that's cool, where are you? And they say, well, we're just getting all the data into a single place, into a single model, and at which point it's kind of a little bit of an intake of breath and oh dear. So yeah, I guess that's kind of the for me, the one that comes up more and more as time goes on, and I don't know why that is. I could guess, but yeah, I guess I don't know if this is something you've seen or something that you would kind of comment on, or in terms of that misunderstanding.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that was true when we wrote the book a year ago, and it's still true, very much so. I mean, yeah, the data mesh is still fairly new, right? I mean, like even the companies that kind of went on board fairly early are still in the phase of figuring out how this is really working. And I think there are some great successes so far, but this is all still in some kind of experimental phase. And I think one of the issues is simply that it's impossible to explain data mesh in 1 or 2 sentences. It is really one of those things that it's simply not possible to explain that quickly. Yeah. And I have kind of two angles at that. So one angle is you can show people something actually working, right? So that really helps a lot to really show someone how a data mesh platform can work, how you can search for data products, then find a couple of data products, figure out what they provide, and then figure out a way how to combine them to build a new data product, something like this, kind of really showing a journey of a working data mesh. I think this is really goes a long way in kind of really giving someone a good understanding of what it's actually about, right? This is the one angle. The other angle I have when I don't have a way of demonstrating it available is to ask certain key questions to make sure there is not a huge misunderstanding, right? And so one of those key questions, for instance, is that I ask, like, well, who is doing access control? Kind of who's giving the right to access data, right? And I think even now, in like more than 50% of the cases of companies who say that they're doing data mesh, they say, well, this is some central governance person or group or something like that, right? Because that must be central. It would be reckless to decentralize the access control, right? And then I immediately have kind of a discussion point saying, okay, well, what would be necessary to decentralize this? Like, what are the implications? What do we need to have in place to really go that far in terms of decentralization?
That's interesting, because your comment about 2 sentences and you can't explain data mesh in 2 sentences. So I think I'm going to take something from what you've just said, because my approach at the moment is to talk at people until they understand, and sometimes that takes many hours.
Yes.
And Andy doesn't mind talking. I want to underscore that, because I think when I talk to teams about the journey, and for a lot of us, that journey initially is a technical journey. I say people get promoted when they are first able to connect to decentralized data sources. It's a big win. You're celebrating, but that really isn't the big win. That's a win. I think the next big win happens when people learn how to use data products, when they first realize that they're agile in nature, that they can be reused and shared. I think the third big win, and we can argue whether the sequence is right, but one of the third big win is when I think teams kind of sit back for a second and they realize the power of what you just described. I know, and when I read your book, you had a use case there on data access. I was telling Andy earlier in the session, I felt like that was my use case. I live that, right? I live the pain of having to sit in the middle of owning a platform. And as a CDO, having a team who was having to go back and forth between data owners and consumers trying to get access, it was an absolute nightmare. I created an incredible platform it was 2019, but I very quickly overloaded my team because we could not keep up with it. When you empower a domain owner or a data product team to be a data steward, to have the ability to grant access, man, you speed up so much, because so much of the weight isn't technology. A lot of the weight is waiting for permission. And so it's a really, really important point. I wanted to also just kind of ask you about something that I misunderstood early in your book. You were talking about waiting on, I think the exact quote was, don't invest in the platform up front, right? And I said, no, that can't be right. You need to start with it. And then I got you. And I really like the point where you're just like, you have to start with an MVP, right? I think what you all said in the book was treat your data mesh program with a product mindset, right? Start small and then add the capabilities. I think that's a really key point kind of in the success in the journey, so to speak. What have you seen on that topic of starting small? Because we say this all the time, right? We don't go out there. I always say, don't go build a data mesh program for the enterprise. Go build a successful, and I like to start with one domain. Go build a successful domain and I like the way you call it a progressive team. Go build a successful domain for a team who really wants to win, and then use them as a showcase. I think that approach is a winning strategy. You guys saw this a year ago, right? Can you talk a bit more about how you came up with that model? Because I think it's the absolutely right way to do it. We try to sell people on that concept because I think it's the right way. I don't know if they always listen. I'd love to hear your thoughts on why that approach works.
Yeah, sure. So honestly, this idea of not focusing too much on an upfront infrastructure or platform investment, that really goes far more back than when data mesh was around, right? So in my consulting work, specifically with ThoughtWorks, over the years, there was basically always the mantra that we were preaching, that, for instance, with a DevOps transformation or something, that it's really not about building the perfect platform first and then all the users will come, right? Because it's simply too much of a risk. Like, the risk is just far too high to build the wrong thing and to build a thing that basically your users won't be interested in, or what's not solving their problems. And so honestly, for me, this is really kind of the standard approach to those kind of programs, where you really change the attitude and the mindset in a company, how to deal with certain technical and business tasks. And so that was really not that new. In general, what I like to do in practice when I work with companies, right, and really accompany them on their data mesh journey, is to really build a first version of a data mesh platform together with the first data product, right? So that you can really figure out, okay, what do we need to build this data product, right? And sometimes there's quite a lot of work to build this very first iteration. But I think this is really something that can help quite a lot. In general, I have to admit that kind of this is something that I'm so kind of trained to preach again and again, that in the last 2 years or so I haven't seen that often anymore. So I feel like clients that I work with already understood this, and kind of every time I say, yeah, don't build the platform up front, more often I get an we know that that makes sense, etc.
Start small, get some wins, build some momentum, and create a showcase. Love it. I want to kind of shift now, and because I really want to get to that question around what will we add to the book. If we could, what would I amend, I change, or what would I add to it? And I have my own ideas, but Andy, if you would you like to go first, Andy?
No, you kick us off.
Okay, I'll kick you off.
Jump in. Yeah.
So what would I, and I'll just start with what I would add to it. At the time the book was written, we didn't have enough use cases out there to really understand how this was impacting the business. So I understand that side of it. I would love to come back in here and add a chapter or 6 around the business impact. If I'm a business leader and I want to understand about data mesh in practice, there's nothing in the book that helps me. Now, again, that don't take it the wrong way. It just means that we didn't have enough examples, but there's a version of this book, I think, that is all about how this impacts the business. I mean, we may never use the word data mesh. We may never use the word domain. We might never use the word data product. It's about delivering data assets or delivering data products to the business team so they can drive insight and actions, but doing that and talking about the speed, talking about the agility, talking about the ability to exploit more, so to speak, more. I can exploit more data. I can bring it to the right people, and the people that understand the data can use it more efficiently. So if I were to amend it or rewrite it, that's what I would focus it on, because I think that's why we build a mesh. We I know we solve a lot of technical issues, and that's amazing, but I almost feel like there was Zhamak was influenced by maybe a business leader, a great business leader came to her and said, look, I'm never going to convince IT to give me the keys. But if you write this book, Zhamak, and you convince IT that it's their idea, they'll give me the keys themselves, right? So a nice little psychology, because that's what's happening here, right? IT is starting to give the business teams the keys. So I would love to hear that side of the story. That's the only thing I would add to it. Andy, how about yourself?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Actually, that's an awesome idea to go into that direction as an extension, or kind of when we maybe write an extended version of the book. Well, I mean, you already said it, right? At the time we were writing it, there simply were no public success stories, or barely even any success stories, to be honest. Like, you have to imagine we wrote the book more like 1.5 years ago. And then it came out about a year ago. So this was really the case, right? So this was simply a limitation at the time. So right now I think would be really an awesome idea to focus on this, and probably focus on this right in the beginning, right? And kind of really start with something like that. Something that would have come to my mind, what I would add now, basically circling back a little bit to that misinterpretation thing that we mentioned in the beginning, and that is the idea and the concept of a data product. That concept, that term gets misinterpreted, or at least gets interpreted very differently so much, right? And that really is an issue.
You're being nice. And you're being nice. That word is misused. I think
it's abused.
It's abused. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but you're spot on.
Yeah. So I think that would be something that I would spend a lot more time on, especially giving concrete examples, kind of how a data product could look like. Really go into different types of data products, how they could look like, etc. Because I also see that not only does it get misinterpreted, but it's also that there are simply different valid interpretations around, right? But you need to have an idea of the scale of how much you can interpret it, and where it starts to be misinterpretation. So for instance, there are really some companies who think of data products as a really big thing, and kind of you structure your data landscape in like 5 data products and that's it. And then there are other companies who think in the thousands, right? And well, this is just a huge gap, right? And so it's tough to say that both are simply correct. But then you need to go into like, okay, what are the advantages and disadvantages in going in either direction, right? So I think this is really something that I would spend quite a bit more time on and being far more specific.
I'll add one more to that, and then I'll get Andy's thoughts. I think just because I didn't want to miss the point. When I see a lot of movement, and there's a new trend there where teams are just focusing on data products, which is fantastic, right? They're and largely IT teams building data products, getting really good at building data products centrally. I know it kind of goes against some of our best practices and pitfalls, but they're getting good at building them. And then the idea is eventually that once they kind of build the guidelines and processes, they'll start to engage domain teams and start to get them to build them, which is fantastic. But I warn customers that you have to be careful if you continue to build more and more data products without the proper framework, right? Without the data mesh, without the concept of federated governance and self-service and everything else that comes with the mesh, the process is going to fall apart. You're going to have dependency issues. You're going to have you're going to create a bigger problem than you have today because they're going to fall apart and you're going to end up rebuilding them. And so I think it's okay if you start with products, but ultimately they have to be supported by a framework, by a process that kind of ensures their sustainability, like data mesh. So
yeah, let me quickly comment on that one again, and that kind of relates a little bit to that don't build a big platform upfront thing. So as said before, it is important to not make this huge upfront investment, but at the same time, it's also important to not miss the point where you have to make that investment, right? Because it is actually crucial. And so kind of going entirely in a different direction and saying, well, let's say whether we even need a data mesh platform or not is also not going to work, right? You need the whole governance process. You need a computational platform that is really supporting that. And that is a huge investment for most companies. And so again, when working with companies, I also try to make that clear that I think it's a good idea to start small and not invest too much upfront, but to also keep it in the back of your head that there will be the point in time, and that is usually, from my experience, when building the third data product or so, where you have to make that big investment in building a data mesh platform and the processes around, right? And that is substantial.
Interesting. So the thing that I'm interested in, which I think touches on quite a few of the things that you've just said, is I quite like, and actually we were talking about this just before you joined, I think it's chapter 5, where we're talking about sustaining the mesh. And I understand why you've done it. You've gone sort of federated computational governance, right? And I think, right, because that's a large part. The thing that I think we are still missing everywhere, in fact, is some form of kind of operating model. And it's not necessarily at the technical, how do we keep the lights on? It's kind of who's responsible for what? Where's kind of the boundary? So when we're talking about federated computational governance, for example, there's this federated group. Who is on that federated group? Who gets that responsibility to kind of sit there and how, and make decisions and how do we, where do we make sure that the things that they suggest are actually the right things, I guess? Because, we could say, actually, we want a general policy to hide PII data. That's cool. But is that appropriate for all domains? And I guess this is where, you say, well, actually, we need some domain responsibility or sort of membership of that. But I guess how does that actually really work? How do you make those decisions? And then how do you, and again, not getting into technology, but then who's responsible for kind of building and I guess almost like auditing a data product before you publish a data product that then other people can kind of use? And we can say, well, we can put controls in there. We can run unit tests to make sure it's a certain quality or it complies with a certain policy set. And that's cool, and maybe we can automate that completely. But I'm not sure anyone's really there yet. So, what are the kind of the manual, responsibilities around that? And I guess I'm looking for like an enhanced RACI matrix with a list of roles and a list of kind of responsibilities, and then almost putting that into a flow chart for creating, for designing or incepting a data product all the way through to getting that out. And
Hey, I gave you a RACI 12 months ago and you hated it, Andy. Come on.
I did, because it was wrong. It was a terrible RACI. Don't listen to him, Arif. But I guess and I understand when you're writing books, you kind of typically have to fit within either a timeline or a certain number of pages or whatever. So you're always constrained. But that would be the thing that I kind of would love. And part of that is, Zhamak's book is amazing, and she brings out a load of new roles. So data product owner, data product developer, domain owner, and she does a reasonable job of defining them all. But I guess what we're missing is, where do they kind of fit in the process? That's the bit that I would love to kind of see.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, I mean, as you're aware of it, this is where things get really complicated, right?
Yes.
Because this involves like actual responsibility, ownership, etc. So this is about people, and this is what's complicated. There are again different angles to this. What I try to establish when I work with clients is kind of to establish different groups that look at the data mesh journey at different abstraction levels, kind of. So basically, I try to create that team that works on the first data product, that first MVP, maybe also on parts of the first data mesh infrastructure, and that then kind of splits up or so. But then I also create, or try to create at the company, a kind of governance or strategy group that is looking at things from a bit of a higher level, right? And also get really management buy-in there, and ideally have the CTO or CDO at least partly being part of that group or so, so that I can really look at the problem very much on the ground and very much on the top, right? And kind of bring then those perspectives together. And ideally, those two groups that I like to form in the beginning of a data mesh journey, they have some overlap. So some of the people in that on the ground group are also part of that strategy group, and so they can inform each other, right? And in the end, that governance group is built the same way, right? Just that then at some point you have many teams that build data products, and you need to have the representatives from those on the ground people, so to say, who kind of bring their perspective in. And at the same time, you really need to have the people in there that bring in legal perspectives, the big business perspective, kind of, etc.
Yeah, that makes sense. But so for your version 2 or edition 2, I'm kind of expecting a good RACI, so not Adrian's one.
Let's see. That's a challenge.
Hey, this has been great. I hope you'll have a chance to listen to the first part. We gave the book a ton of compliments, I'm sure, as you've gotten over the last year. But there's a lot that where we were most impressed with was how relevant it still was. And that's hard to do. I said in IT terms, this book should be in a museum. It's a year old, but the reality is it's still extremely relevant. The lessons are spot on. The pitfalls are accurate. And so there's stuff that we just described we'd love to add if we could, but I think that's just only to complement the book, not necessarily change it. So thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. And we had a good time reading the book that you and Max wrote. So I think we're closed. Andy, any closing thoughts on your side?
No. I just echo what you said, and thank Arif for joining us. Actually, you're our first guest on the Data Mesh Book Club. We've done quite a few of these, and you're our
awesome.
First actual author. So it's been cool.
We should send him some swag. We'll send you some swag. There you go.
Awesome.
Hey, thanks a bunch. Have a great evening, everybody, or a great morning wherever you are.
Perfect.
Yes,
Bye.
Cheers. We invite you to join us to the next installment of the Data Mesh Book Club. We're going to cover book 3, The Fundamentals of Data Engineering, written by Joe Reese and Matt Housley.